You talked about definitions of Canadian cinema being in transformation and flux, and that was one point that we've been really keying into in the film, and a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about it. We looked at a film like Juno, and I actually got a chance to ask Jason Reitman at the Up in the Air conference, because I know it's something he's been really outspoken about. How much integrity do we claim for the cinema that's made within our boundaries? Specifically with the film like Juno, which we're looking at, directed by a Canadian crew, shot in Canada, key Canadian cast, still doesn't qualify as a Canadian film. What are your visions of what actually we define as a Canadian film? Do you think we have to be stringent? Like, do we lose something if we're not defining films that don't have Canadian funding attached to them? Or is it more about who the key creators are and the energy that goes into that film that really defines what is Canadian and what isn't?
I think he's changed over the years. I mean, he used to be hugely nationalistic about this, but somehow I don't think it matters in quite the same way. It's obviously it's where the person has come from. I mean, if they're a born Canadian, where they go, they'll take a part of their sensibility with them. But just in terms of kind of nationalist breakdowns, when you're looking at art, it has a certain validity. Of course, it does. But at the same time, there's so many artists I don't look upon as being a British artist or an Australian artist or an American artist. I mean, they're, a group like U2 is an Irish band, but it's kind of owned by the world in a funny way. I mean, their music is just universal. And I think there's certain filmmakers, certain artists who arrive at that point. And I think, Cronenberg is one prime example here in Canada. David has kind of flirted with notions of, is he a Canadian artist? He was always working within genre filmmaking, especially the early part of his career, science fiction films, horror films. Didn't seem natural to, what we produced here in Canada. We came out of a very strong documentary tradition. It didn't look like Going Down the Road or anything else that was being produced at that point in time. And David's career has morphed over many years, and he's made, films based on work by international authors like William Burroughs and Ballard, people like that, J.G. Ballard. So David's just pursued his own career. At the same time, absolutely, he's a Canadian artist. He lives here. He shoots his films here in Toronto. He occasionally shoots elsewhere, but he's just one of those artists again who he's an artist at the end of the day. He doesn't see himself as a Canadian. He's just who and what he is. So, the nationalist part of it, and Quebec is a little bit different because obviously they had a very strong nationalist agenda that they were trying to achieve at a certain point in their history. And that's shifted a little bit. The linguistic differences obviously, brand that cinema a different kind of way. So for me, and I think, my thinking over the years has just shifted and changed. I'm still interested in national cinemas. I'm still, a country like Iran, that emerges, or a country like China. I'm still interested in what comes from a Chinese filmmaker or an Iranian filmmaker. But by the same time, I guess I don't really get hung up in terms of is it so important that a Canadian filmmaker deals with Canadian subject matter all the time and puts Canadians in his film or her films. They naturally, of course, will attempt to do that, but they're right now, I think, we need to give them space to breathe, air, freedom, liberty to do whatever they want to. Just look at our novelists, for God's sake. They have complete freedom to write about anything they want to. I mean, the Timothy Findleys of this world, their imagination ranges all over Europe as well as it does Canada. No one's ever said that Timothy Findley was not a Canadian writer. Ditto with Margaret Atwood. So it's again one of those things that I think is it's like a straitjacket, and we shouldn't get too hung up with those issues. The country's changing, let's face it, as well. I mean, it's a very different country than it was 20, 30 years ago, when I think these issues were really, really important. I mean, it's such a homogenous, multicultural community, or it's a very multicultural, very diverse country at this point in time that feeds on many, many different cultures, many different histories, many different backgrounds.
I agree. I mean, I think defining a national cinema is always an act of will, and it's probably best left to critics and the people who come afterwards. The films and the filmmakers are always going to smear those boundaries in ways that are sometimes really interesting. So I don't think it's really for us necessarily to say what is Canadian and to try to put a straitjacket on it anymore. I think those days are long gone.